You too, I assume,
I
right?
am. And I'm gonna be sort of championing a policy process to keep herbicides
Oh, no, it's
available.
it's the monkey. It's the monkey.
Hoping some people will pick up.
It's the monkey.
John, how are
It's the
you
monkey.
doing?
Arianthi and Dick Clay, I got them all. I never. Hey, you know,
Nobody.
I bet you. Oh, no, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, but see, what,
I have to get started.
I know we're already up. See, you have, I want to, I just wait before. That, you did, how, you remember it?
Can people hear me?
Yeah, I don't have it. I don't have it.
Can anyone hear me?
You wrote it, didn't you?
Yeah, I wrote it, of course.
You probably, you still have it?
Can the people on Zoom hear? Okay.
No, I have a few extra copies of it.
Yeah, yes, I can hear.
Yep, I can hear.
Somebody said they said.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So my speaker must be working. Okay. Is this where you'd like to sit here?
Okay, welcome everybody. It's presentation for the Yolo Colusa chapter of the California Native Plant Society. My name is Dan Potter. I'm currently serving as president of this chapter. But this evening's meeting is really just about a presentation by Dr. Glenn Holston. I'll have an introduction in a minute. I do want to let you know that we have a board of directors for this chapter, and we've been meeting monthly over the last year plus, as long as the chapter has been in existence. And we have our monthly meeting for this month is tomorrow evening on Zoom. And we're still a year in, sort of getting ourselves organized. And one of the things that we're working on currently is some chapter operating guidelines that will include things about our procedures for voting and so on in the future. And we'll be making all that information public to all the members. But as I said, for now, the focus this evening is on the talk. So I'm going to turn things over to our speaker coordinator to.
Hello, I'm John. I'm the speaker coordinator. So I'd like to introduce Glenn. Glenn Holstein, many of you know him already. I only met him recently, but after reviewing his background, I can see that he's among the people that I should know in this field. Glenn is a graduate of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in biology, and he entered graduate school at UCB studying botany. From there, he took a few years off to help found the California Natural Diversity Database, participate in creation of the Consumnes, Cold Canyon, Nipomo Dunes, and Carrizo Plain Reserves, and write a chapter on riparian biogeography for Warner and Hendrix's California Riparian Systems. After that, he finished his botany PhD at Davis with a dissertation on climatic influences on plant features in world biomes. As a botanical consultant, he has seen much of California and its rare plants. He's been a conservationist for many years, and in retirement has devoted more time to CNPS. He co-edited and wrote 3 articles for the Fremont issue in 2011 on California's prairies and grasslands. In 2023, he founded and was the delegate on our new Yolo Colusa chapter. He also works with conservation groups on projects that include developing the Yolo Habitat Conservancy, creating Berryessa Stone Mountain National Monument, conserving Woodland Regional Park Reserve, and the campaign to protect Walla Loyote Walker Ridge. This evening, he will speak on the California prairie, our state's least understood and protected widespread ecosystem, which has historically been misdescribed and misunderstood. It's a major source of California's biological diversity, but often is dismissed as a non-native annual grassland and destroyed for development. Its value as an important part of nature in our state should be better appreciated so it can be adequately protected. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for a good introduction like that. And I also want to point out that we have a table back there if you'd like more information about what we're doing here with the new chapter. We have a sign-up sheet for different kinds of email lists that you may want to join, and that's the table by the back door. But we'll start out here talking about John Muir a little bit. John Muir really, even though he was a Californian, his influence extends far beyond California because he was really the first person in the world to really get the idea out to people that nature isn't something to just be used up. It's something that has value in its own right, and it's something to be loved and appreciated. And that idea, even though it started with John in California, has now gone around the world, and just about every place on earth has a national park. And it was really John that established the idea of having parks to protect nature. And it started right here in our own state of California. This is not moving. It's not moving the slides. Is it this one? Do it here. Does that work better?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Well, in 1868, right after the American Civil War, and by the way, in the aftermath of the Civil War, John Muir walked all the way from his family home in Wisconsin all the way down to the Gulf. And right after the terrible tragedies of the Civil War had happened, he described what he saw a lot. And very soon afterwards, however, he took a boat to San Francisco and with a friend walked down through the Coast Range in a beautiful California spring in 1868. When he got as far as Pacheco Pass, he started walking downslope, walking east across the Central Valley. And the Central Valley was a very different place than what we know today. It wasn't a place of almond orchards and irrigated crops. It was pretty much a kind of a wild wilderness, except for just a few towns. The gold rush had focused most of the population up into the mountains, and they'd left a lot of the valley alone. So when John walked across and described what he saw as he walked across, he was really in a wilderness with pronghorns, kit foxes, spadefoot toads, kangaroo rats, and this is one of the world's center of kangaroo rat diversity in our Central Valley. And prairie falcons. These relatives of the peregrine falcons live in cliffs. Unlike peregrines, they like dry country, they like open country, the kind of country that's in the Central Valley with rock formations that they nest in both the Coast Range and the Sierra Nevada. Well, he wrote about what he saw, and this is kind of an imagination of what he might have seen as he walked across the Central Valley on his way to the Sierra Nevada, which he'd heard about on his way to the Yosemite Valley. And you notice there are lots of flowers there. Flowers, and he wrote about flowers that like he'd never seen before. Flowers as far as you can see. He described the Central Valley as not flowers amid grass, but grass amid the flowers. Something walking clear from Wisconsin down to the Gulf of Mexico. He never saw a place like this that had so many flowers. And you can still find places like that where the flowers go on and on. And he described these flower fields that went on and on for miles as bee pastures. Lots of different kinds of flowers and just a place for bees to pasture on that went on for miles and miles as far as he could see. But even though he described that Central Valley, that's not what made it into the textbooks for universities. The ecology textbooks were influenced by this fellow here, Frederick Clements from Nebraska. And he had the idea that a particular climate produces a particular kind of vegetation. And he also had some theories like annuals. Annual plants aren't vegetation, no matter how many there are. And that vegetation converges to a climatic climax. So whatever the climate is, that determines what the vegetation is. California's open areas are in the Midwest climax. And I'll show you a map in a minute of what he did with that. And they're dominated by perennial bunch grass. Well, the problem with the climatic climax theory is climate can change pretty fast. All the perennial ice, the glaciers in the Sierra Nevada melted and then came back in the little ice age, which was only a few hundred years ago. And we have trees that are older than the changes in the climate that we already know about going back several hundred years. We have trees that go back 1,000 years and more. And so climate changes, so it's pretty hard to lock in a particular kind of vegetation type, because what if the climate changes? It's going to be a different vegetation, or is it going to be something that's still hanging on because it can live a long time, like these great conifers that we have here in the forests of California? Well, his system did work quite well in the eastern part of the United States. Pretty much all the way from the Gulf of Mexico well up into Canada, there were forests, oftentimes deciduous forests, sometimes pine forest, but it was definitely forest country. So you could say, well, that was evidence for his climatic climax theory. This area had a distinctive climate and a distinctive kind of vegetation that pretty much covered the landscape all up and down the eastern part of North America outside the tropics. And the climate was pretty typical. The lower curve on this climate diagram is the temperature. And this is the temperature in New York City and Central Park. You notice that the curve of temperature goes down below 0 on the left and a little bit to the right. That means that's the time when conditions are freezing, when most plants can't grow. And then the darker area with the vertical lines above that is rainfall, or sometimes snowfall. And as you can see in Central Park, it's pretty much constant throughout the year. But the actual surplus is going to be in the winter and the spring and the early fall and into late fall, when you have lots of precipitation still falling, but the temperature is falling as well, so it's not being used up nearly as fast. And then if you go into the middle part of North America, all the way from northern Mexico well into Canada, you see grasslands that go on for miles as well. Areas covered with native grasses of various kinds. They tend to get shorter as you go west into drier climates, but basically you have one of the largest grasslands where it's still intact on the entire planet. And this also has a very distinctive climate. As you can see, in Omaha, it gets pretty cold in the wintertime where plants can't grow. And you don't have that surplus of water in the wintertime like you do in Central Park. So the winter doesn't produce nearly as much precipitation as the summer does. And that happens to coincide exactly with the growing season. When the temperature curve is high, so is the rainfall curve high. Well, we had a fellow named, can't think of his name right now, but he was an important early ecologist for the state of California. and worked in the state of California. And he was very much involved in the climax theory, but he had a hard time. What's the climax vegetation of California with its very different Mediterranean climate? He said, well, the most distinctive kind of vegetation we have here in California that is different from everything else is chaparral. So he thought of, because we had a consistent Mediterranean climate, except where it got really wet or really dry, that chaparral must have covered all of California, including the Central Valley. So he thought of the Central Valley and all the hills up and down California as looking like this. Chaparral covered by shrubs, because that was a distinctive kind of vegetation, and we had a distinctive kind of climate. But Frederick Clements saw things differently. You can see on the right, that blue, that's his forest that went all the way from the Gulf of Mexico into southern Canada, with that climate like New York City. The yellow in the middle, the great grasslands that go all the way from northern Mexico into Canada and are especially well developed in his home state of Nebraska. But he came out to California and saw this great Central Valley, and he couldn't imagine that ever being covered with chaparral, and he was correct about that, I believe. But he said, well, it's open country. It looks like it's never had woody vegetation on it, so it must be like my home state of Nebraska. So as you can see, need to go back a little bit. So he took the climatic climax of Nebraska, where he was from, said, well, the Central Valley doesn't have trees or shrubs, so it looks like Nebraska. Therefore, he gerrymandered the climatic climax. This is a Clements map. He produced this map and made the Central Valley the same as Nebraska in his climatic climax map of all of North America. And you notice he also had things like the Northwest Coastal Forest, the desert, a little bit of areas of chaparral along the south coast. This is really interesting, this gerrymandered Nebraska in the middle of the California's Central Valley. Well, because there were stipa grasslands and Nebraska, which he considered the same as the Central Valley, he thought, well, the Central Valley must have been, if it was in the climatic climax of Nebraska, must have had stipa as well. He found a few, there's certainly stipa here. But that became such a dogma in textbooks that it became a whole industry of growing purple needlegrass to restore the Central Valley to all those places that Clements marked out in yellow as the natural vegetation. It even was used to restore the front yard of the Davis post office. Well, we have a great entomologist here, retired now, but still very active, Art Shapiro, and he said, that doesn't really work for what I'm finding with butterflies. The butterflies that I'm finding are not the kind that you find in areas where there's lots of bunch grass like stipa. They're the kind of things that go with forbs, go with wildflowers. And the butterflies he found were the kind that like wildflowers, not bunch grass. So he said, I'm very skeptical of Clements' theory that purple needlegrass once covered Central Valley. And you can find places like John Muir described still in the valleys around the Central Valley, the valleys in the Coast Range. But the idea that the bunch grasses dominated much of California, especially in the Central Valley, was pushed a lot by the flora that people depended on for description of plants before the new gypsum manuals came out. And they have a section listing the vegetation types of California. And two of them are valley grassland and coastal prairie. In other words, the areas close to the coast were prairie, and the areas in the Central Valley were grassland. Well, you do get in the fog belt along the coast some pretty distinctive vegetation. You get species that are only in the fog belt. This would be extreme coastal prairie. And then as you go inland, what would be called valley grassland is almost everywhere dominated by non-native introduced annuals, mostly from the Mediterranean basin, which not only has a climate a lot like ours, but has had farming and disturbance for many, many years longer than we have here in California. Well, when you actually look at where purple needlegrass, this bunch grass that supposedly covered all of California on a map of California, all those blue dots are where purple needlegrass was found. The actual Central Valley, where Clemens taught everybody that was the home of purple needlegrass, hardly has any. And you go out to the coast, which was described as coastal prairie, that's where you find more needlegrass, purple needlegrass, than you do in the Central Valley, which was marked with that yellow gerrymander, supposedly the great home of purple needlegrass. Well, there actually is a grass that's a native grass that's much more commonly found in the Central Valley, pretty much up and down from the north to the south, and that is creeping wild rye. It also goes right out to the coast, so it could be as much a coastal prairie grass as a valley grassland grass. Well, the idea that our grasslands are named after non-native species primarily, which are the most common cover, isn't appreciated down in southern Chile, where the commonest vegetation are non-native bunch grass, non-native brooms, big shrubs with yellow flowers, many species, but they cover the landscape much more than the native forests. But they have those mapped as the native forest with Nothofagus trees and crinodendron trees with those beautiful red flowers, and they value their native forest where it still survives and hasn't been cut and hasn't been replaced by lots and lots of brooms, many square miles of brooms. And then if you try to fit California into one of these climatic climaxes, whether it's purple needlegrass or whether it's a chaparral or whether it's something else, it gets really hard if you look anywhere. You can see what's a real mosaic of vegetation. You get up on the slopes, you can get chaparral. On some terraces, you get oak woodland, and you get open areas with grassland or possibly historically covered with wildflowers like John Muir saw. So you get all of them, and you even get, in this case, non-native riparian vegetation along Cache Creek. So California, unlike any of the other climax areas, doesn't work so well because it has so many different varieties of vegetation. So why doesn't the climatic climax work as well in California as it does in Central Park or in Nebraska? Well,
Yeah.
if you look at the climate in Pasadena, you can see that the rain falls when it's cold and doesn't fall when it gets hot, and the temperature rises to the great point where plants can grow. And then when the temperature starts cooling down again, the rain starts falling again. If you compare that to Nebraska's prairie, you see something that is the exact opposite. Temperature goes up, rainfall goes up. It's just the opposite of a Mediterranean climate. So to lump those two in the same climatic climax may not have been the best theory that we need to follow. Well, one of the things about, just to go back to that one climatic climate diagram of Pasadena, you notice lots of precipitation, rain in the wintertime, nothing in the summertime. But when those two lines cross, like right here and here, that's when you get water, temperature rising enough for plants to start growing. So that's a critical time, that time between the winter rains, the summer drought, that plants need to take advantage of. Well, here's a place not very far away. The hillsides in the foreground, hillsides in the background are at the exact same moment in time. Therefore, they're subjected to the same kind of climate. But boy, you couldn't get more different kinds of vegetation. In the foreground, you get oak woodland. If you look down at the base of the oak trees, the grass is all brown and dried up. Well, if you look at the hills in the background, everything is still green, and there aren't any oak trees except down in the deepest ravines. Why is that? It doesn't fit the climatic climax theory because these are definitely in the same climate. But the reason is that the hills in the background are clay-rich marine sediments, rich in clay, and the clay keeps the winter precipitation close to the surface. It keeps oxygen that would feed the roots of oak trees out from down deep. Whereas in the foreground, you have volcanic rock with deep cracks that go down 30 feet or more, and you have oak trees with roots that go down 30 feet or more as well. So that water in the volcanic rocks can penetrate really deep, really fast, and leave the annual grasses at the surface without water. So they dry up and die much more quickly than the hills in the background that are rich in clay. So California has something really different. It has something where the soils and the geology, because water that falls in the winter needs to have a place to be stored until temperatures warm up enough that it can feed growing plants. The soils and the geology are where that water is stored. And if the soils and geology are different from place to place, the vegetation is going to be different from place to place as well. Well, we do have that common creeping wild rye in lots of places in the Central Valley. Real native grass, beautiful native grass. It's oftentimes thought of as just being a kind of a wetland grass, but it can grow straight up hillsides. One of the things that you don't see it on hillsides as much as you might, because it's like ice cream to cattle, and areas where cattle have grazed, it disappears. But when the cattle are taken off the land, rhizomes get a second chance, and the grass comes back covering hillsides, which is happening now in areas in the Berkeley Hills that aren't actually built on. You have this big patches of this creeping wild rye in the Berkeley Hills in areas that aren't grazed and aren't urbanized either. But there are many places where you see annuals, forbs, the kind of things that John Muir described, like this Rajabothri stipitatus, Amsinkia intermedia, which is so insensitive to disturbance that it actually can come up in fields, and it even is a weed in Australia. It grows so well. That's still one of our native forbs, like John Muir on his walk across the Central Valley undoubtedly saw. And along the roads where farming isn't taking place, you see all kinds of forbs like those that John Muir saw, like these little lupins. But California, because of that strict moment in time where the flowers have to put on a big show for the pollinators, between the time water falls in the wintertime and the time things dry out in the summertime, they have to put on a big show for their pollinators. That's why we have some of the most spectacular wildflowers in the world, like these California poppies. And we have places like Bear Valley where the wildflowers just go on and on, very much like what John Muir described, close to home here. And unlike the bunch grasses that Clements predicted would show up in neglected areas in Central Valley, the perennial that does show up is narrow-leaved sunflower, Boethia angustiflora. This is right along one of the highways south of the town of Dix. Then we have whole hillsides where the bulbs start flowering all at once. Cortelia laxa covering whole hillsides in areas all around our region in the right year. Believe it or not, in a good year, you can even see the bottom of the Central Valley covered with forbs, bee pastures like John Muir described. This was a field in Kern County where I got out of my car, took a picture from I-5, flowers as far as I could see, bee pastures, just like John Muir described in Kern County in today, not many, many years ago, but today. Has to be a good year, but when there's a super bloom, you can still find it in California Central Valley. And you can see them in valleys next to the Central Valley as well. But you know, those areas were written off in the textbooks for a long time. They were said, well, we just had too many cattle and they wiped out all the bunch grasses, and these wildflowers here, even though John Muir described them, they're still there today. Oh, they're just weeds that have taken over after the cattle wiped out all the bunch grasses and drove the bunch grasses to extinction. Well, that was kind of believed for a while. In fact, it was believed when I was in grad school. It was the dogma. Until Richard Minnick, professor from UC Riverside, looked beyond just what John Muir wrote about. And he, for the first time, looked at the Spanish archives left by the earliest people that wrote about what the Central Valley was like, the earliest explorers. And they said it was just like in Spanish, though, what John Muir described, flowers and flowers and flowers that went on forever, some grasses, but not very many. And this book that described this is called California's Fading Wildflowers by Richard Minnick. He's the one that really turned the corner on our history of what we have here in California. Well, one of the things that affects our native forbs, places like you can see in the middle there, a white native, Nanthes alba, called meadowfoam, that is one of those native forbs like John Muir saw, wetter areas. But if you cross the fence, you don't see that at all. The reason is the central part was grazed, and the grazing kept out non-native weeds. The area beyond the fence wasn't grazed, so the non-native wild radishes crowded out all the native flowers. So grazing is oftentimes put down, but it's can be a very important element for keeping native plants dominant. You can see here how the sheep can live just fine. Sheep are once considered very destructive, and they certainly can be, especially on islands. But right here, they've made space for the native wildflowers, and they don't allow them to be crowded out by more aggressive non-native invaders. You can see the same thing in a valley further to the north. Great flower diversity coexisting with cattle grazing. Beautiful landscapes like this. Cattle, lupins, all working together to create a wonderful landscape that has native oaks in the background and native wildflowers in the foreground. And actually, probably what's happened is that the cattle that graze these fields now are stand-ins for when Thule elk used to graze the open areas of California. Because ecologically, the Thule elk aren't all that different from cattle. They both basically eat up whatever they can find in open areas on the ground. And so did antelope. Antelope were here as well. They disappeared first, but they're being reintroduced to California as well. They're another one that keep the weeds down and the native wildflowers up. The California Rangeland Conservation Coalition, primarily made up of ranchers, has been one of the most important groups to preserve open landscapes in California where native plants, native wildflowers still remain dominant. And they have a huge range of protected landscapes that are used for cattle and used for native wildflowers up and down primarily the edges of the Central Valley. And that's an important element for what we're talking about now of preserving 30 by 30, 30% of the land, 30% of the ocean for natural landscapes. And these ranchers in their California Rangeland Coalition are actually doing it. Well, as you move into summer, flowers and the plants don't just all die away. We get a different group. We get things like turkey mullet, not very showy. It has flowers, but they're not showy, but it certainly is well adapted to the drier part of late spring and early summer. Here's another one that can get into late summer and, late fall and early summer. It's beautiful golden Mariposa lily, Calochortus luteus covering its slope. And here's a whole field at the same time of Sidalcia diplocypha, not a very famous plant, but forming the same kind of landscape on a local scale that John Muir described in the Central Valley. Flowers and flowers and flowers that are doing just fine and are native dominance. And you even get well into summer. Sometimes in a good year, you get perennial lupins. Now, most of the lupins in lowland California are annuals, and you get a lot of perennial lupins as you go up into the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. But we have one perennial lupin that in a good year can cover slopes in the Central Valley and its adjacent foothills right at sea level. This is Lupinus formosus, the only low elevation perennial lupin we have, and a beautiful plant. Here's its flowers. And just west of the UC Davis campus is Glide Ranch, a little bit of the valley that's been protected by UC Davis over the years. And that's covered with these star-like white tar plants, Amazonia congesta, that just like John Muir described, they go on until they reach the fence and it's no longer UC Davis landscape, but very much like what John Muir described, except later in the year, well into early summer. But more than anything else, we have a plant that when it started getting cold up in Yosemite Valley, John Muir came down out of the mountains and crossed the Central Valley once again. Everywhere he went, he described a plant that we now know as Holocarpa virgata. And we can see how spectacular that was and how it caught John Muir's eyes as he came out of the Sierra Nevadas and crossed the valley again. It goes on, just like John Muir described, for miles and miles. Here's a valley in the Coast Range. Here's the Central Valley floor. That's Holocarpa virgata as far as you can see. More bee pastures, but these are late summer and early fall. And going up the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, clear across the valley as what certainly we might call a dominant plant. But when a textbook was written about the terrestrial vegetation of California, that plant isn't mentioned. Think that a plant that would cover miles and miles of California from the Coast Range through the Central Valley and all up into the Sierra foothills might be mentioned in the terrestrial vegetation in California, but it's completely ignored. But if you want to read about it, look at weeds of California. It'll tell you how to kill it. Because it's got to be a weed because it's not purple needlegrass. Well, you can see the same kinds of places that John Muir described. They're still around. Go on forever, miles and miles of bee pastures like this Monolopia lanceolata, like these lupins, and you can see how different vegetation can be. In the foreground, we have Great Valley Formation, uplifted marine sediments, and in the background across Cache Creek, we have serpentine hillsides. So on the foreground, very few trees. On the background, lots of trees and shrubs. No chaparral in the foreground, lots of chaparral in the background. A different substrate on one side of the creek, very different substrate on this side of the creek with completely different vegetation. So that was why it was so hard to get California to fit with the climax theory, because vegetation changed too rapidly from place to place because geology changed too rapidly. And it was the geology in the soils that held that winter water so that when things warmed up, it could be used by the growing plants. Well, this is being described now by California Native Plant Society in its textbook, California Vegetation, that goes further in describing vegetation, including things we've seen here that the older books ignored. And they're still mapping the vegetation of California with a very good system. And excellent work is being done by California Native Plant Society on that. But one of the reasons that vegetation has been so hard to map here in California is that it changes very rapidly as the geology changes in space. So you can have one slope, like the one on the left, that's chaparral, one slope in the middle, that's oak woodland, and one slope on the right, that's prairie, covered with annuals of either grass or forbs. So even within the same area, you can get a complete mosaic of climates of vegetation, which is really what you see when you go out in most parts of California. And the thing is, what makes it really complicated is there's a change in time. Remember when John Muir walked across the Central Valley in the spring and he saw all these beautiful spring wildflowers? Then he walked back across the Central Valley in late summer, early fall, and found Holarcarpa brigada going as far as you could see. And he wasn't here in the summertime, so he didn't see that perennial lupin, Lupinus formosus. Those all can be at the same spot, with one vegetation in the spring, one vegetation in the summer, and one vegetation in the fall. And the weeds follow that as well. The annual grasses are most important in the spring. They tend to be replaced later on in the summer and even into the early fall by another weedy non-native yellow star thistle. So how are you going to map a place on the landscape that changes so much during time? That's something that is not new to vegetation history, and there's not been a real tradition of how to map vegetation that changes so rapidly in time like it does in parts of California. So what do you call this vegetation that John Muir found and called bee pastures that went on for miles? Today it's most commonly called grassland, but as we can see, the natives were pretty scarce. The native grasses were pretty scarce. Only later did they become dominant in so many places like they are now. Well, the plants that John Muir saw, both going across the valley in the spring and coming back in the late summer and early fall, were forbs. That means annuals that are herbaceous plants that aren't grasses. So you could call it forbland. Steppe is a name that is more common in Eurasia. Or you could call it prairie, which is neutral on what dominates it as long as they're herbaceous plants. But prairie is it only used in Nebraska? Well, it's certainly used there. And here we have various kinds of prairie. Coastal prairie, which was in the Muntz book as one of the vegetation types. We have Palouse prairie, which is in the drier parts of especially Washington State. Shortgrass prairie in the drier parts of the central U.S. Tallgrass prairie with taller grasses further east when there's more, a little bit more rainfall. Then we have prairie falcons, which we saw earlier, and then little house on the prairie. So prairie is a pretty common name. Well, I like to use the term California prairie, and I didn't come up with it. I didn't invent it. It was actually before Munson Keck's book came out on that had the chapter saying that there was coastal prairie and valley grassland. There was a book on the ecology of all of North America. Very good book. And they were actually much more accurate than what came later because they called what we have here, the areas dominated by forbs and grasses, herbs, they called it California prairie. That was the name they used. It was only later when Munson Keck came out and was used by so many people that it got split into valley grassland and coastal prairie, even though most of the most important species are in both. And here's a very important monograph on grazing land in California. Very, very useful book. Came out also before Munson Keck. And if you notice at the bottom, it used that term, California prairie. Only with Munson Keck did that start disappearing and the name started being changed to grassland, especially in the hotter parts of California. Well, if you get environmental reports, they protect farmland, agriculture, they protect marshlands, they protect vernal pools to some extent, they protect riparian forests, they protect oak woodland. But when you come to these great areas of flowers, this just gets written off as non-native annual grassland, something as a free fire zone for urban development that gets absolutely no protection at all, even though going back to the earliest explorers, they found the same thing. This is the true native vegetation of all the parts of California that aren't dominated by trees and shrubs. You can still find in a good year places like this. Well, the CNPS 5th edition inventory, prairie species are on lists. They are the ecosystem with the most 1A species. In other words, the most species that have gone extinct, and you can kind of see why. If it's a free fire zone for development, if there's no protection for it, if it's on the valley floor, which is either irrigated farmland or urban areas, no wonder so many native species there went extinct, more than any other ecosystem. But actually, if you go up to just rare species, 1B, it's actually third because it doesn't have as many species, it doesn't have as high a diversity. And in all lists, it's fourth with 247 species because the greatest diversity is in the mountains where there's less disturbance in areas that are more likely to be protected or non-urbanized or not turned into irrigated farmland. So we have more extinct species, but not as many rare species in this prairie habitat. Well, if you look at California's native prairie species, 95 species are obligate, means they can only occur in prairie. 563 are facultative. In most cases, those are ones that move up into the oak woodland and grow as an understory under oaks, but they also get out away from the oaks in open prairie. 66 are obligate vernal pool species, only found in vernal pools. 58 are facultative vernal pool species that can occur both in vernal pools and prairie outside of vernal pools. 28 are obligate only in alkaline prairie, a special kind of prairie that is chemically different. And then 44 are those facultative alkaline prairie species that can occur in both alkaline and non-alkaline prairies. If you look at the largest obligate prairie families, 38 are in the Asteraceae, the sunflower family. 10 are in the Orobanchaceae, primarily because of all of the little plants in Downingia that are so abundant in our vernal pools. And we also have lots of other plants in the Orobanchaceae that are in obligate prairies, little things like owl's clovers, for example. And then the third most important obligate prairie family is the Boraginaceae, which now includes the Hydrophalaceae as well. Largest facultative prairie families are a little bit different. Still, the sunflower family is the biggest, but second is the Fabaceae, because so many lupins can occur in the prairies, can also move up into the understory of oaks in the same way with Boraginaceae. Not so much Orobanchaceae with its owl's clovers, because they tend to be sticklers for the true prairie and are not plants that move into the oak woodland nearly as much as these other families. Largest obligate vernal pool families are, once again, sunflower families, but the second one is actually Poaceae, which is because we have a lot of vernal pool grasses like Tectoria and grasses like that, only in vernal pools. And then because of Downingia, we have third family in obligate for vernal pools is the Campanulaceae with Downingia. I may have misspoke earlier. This is the Downingia family that is very important in vernal pools. The Medianae subtribe, the subtribe that includes the tar plants, has very, very many, 20 obligate prairie species and 36 facultative prairie species. So that particular subtribe of the sunflower family, which includes things like Holocarpa virgata, is particularly important in our prairie ecosystem, especially among the obligate prairie species. And then we have a family, the Themidaceae, that now has been lumped in the asparagus family as a subfamily of the asparagus family. In this case, 67% are obligate or facultative prairie species. And this is the family that, excuse me, includes your rhodias and your tritelias. So out of 5,262 total native California species, this is what was the number in the Jepson manual, 855 are California prairie species, and that's 16% of the total native species we have here in California. Looking at conservation of prairie, here's a map of an area called Cordova Hills. And there was a plan to completely urbanize that. And this is quite an unusual place because it's the only place I've ever been in Sacramento County, which is actually the county with the lowest high elevation of any of the more than 50 counties here in California, even lower than anything in San Francisco right on the coast. But this, even though Sacramento County is very low, this was the only place I've ever been in Sacramento County where you can get on that landscape and not see a single building or a bit of infrastructure in sight. Completely wild country. And there was plans to cover that with a development that would have no transportation, completely leapfrog development out there in the wildest part of Sacramento County. But back then, we were listened to when we commented on the ER, what an ecological disaster that was. And it's still, prairie still survives there. Glad to see that. Well, here's an area called the Bear Creek Unit. And this was one of the last areas that was actually added to the Bureau of Land Management lands that are adjacent to Prairies Snow Mountain National Monument. But there were people who said, oh, this is an area that should never be incorporated into the Bureau of Land Management. It was too heavily overgrazed. The cattle ate everything right down to the soil surface. That's a terrible place to ever turn over to the federal government. Well, when the great botanist Ellen Dean went there, she found a plant that she'd been looking for and had barely found anywhere else. It's called California maculosa, and this is our native member of the same family that includes our non-native erodiums. It was widespread in the prairie country of California, but now it's virtually extinct because it can't take areas that aren't heavily grazed because it's crowded out by more aggressive non-native species. Woodland's another place that we found that there were rare plants right outside of town in an area that was called Woodland Regional Park, but it was scheduled to be a shopping mall by the Planning Commission of Woodland. Well, we talked to folks in Woodland and the Yolo Habitat Conservancy and Tuolumne, and we got it preserved as a reserve for a federally endangered species, palmate bird's beak, Chloropyron palmatum. There's also another rare plant that's not officially listed, but alkali milk vetch, Astragalus tenor is also there. Not very abundant, but through good management, alkali milk vetch, and especially palmate bird's beak is actually doubled in population because we have a group of people, including help from the city of Woodland now. No longer do they want a shopping mall. They love having a rare plant preserve right at their doorstep. Is helping us very much. And we've had as many as 80 people come out to help us build our trails and help take care of the rare plants. 80 volunteers, not getting paid. They just do it because they love nature. Well, here's a place that is just north of Davis. You can see it's got water ponded there. It's an area that Downengia pulchella has a large population. There's Downengia pulchella up close, and when you get a lot of that, then it can actually, as the water dries up, it can look like a pond of blue, but it's the flowers then, it's not the water. And then you get Myosurus minimus, a little tiny plant in the ranunculus family, that little white flower down there, mostly associated with vernal pools. And then here's one that's especially found in alkaline prairie. This is, see the name of this one. Anyway, it's a perennial, and it's a good native, mostly in alkaline prairie. Here's Plagiabothria stipitatus. It's also there, mostly a vernal pool plant. And here we have that wonderful, beautiful alkaline milk vetch. And this is the largest unprotected population anywhere in the region of this very rare plant on the verge of extinction. Here it is close up, beautiful plant, very rare. And one of the reasons it's rare, if you look at its range, its only range in the entire world is between the Bay Area and the Sacramento area. So the fact that we have the largest unprotected population right here in our backyard, just north of the cannery, and just beyond the city limits of Davis, I think it might be a good idea to protect it. Anybody here who would like to protect this area of the plant? And a few hands there can help us. Great. And here's the plan of the landowner. Here's on the left, that's where the vernal pool is, where the rare plants are. There on the right is the developer's plans to cover them. And if you look up the biology of this, it's never been able to survive when its habitat is removed. It's never been able to be transported anywhere else. This plant's under threat, and it's also the most significant unprotected population of this very rare plant that's on the verge of extinction.
Mm.
We also had a little situation where the county wanted to turn a rare plant area within the federal jurisdiction habitat for some of the rarest species in the world. The Grasslands Regional Park, they wanted to turn it into a solar farm, cover the rare plant designated area, but they didn't even realize it was a rare plant, federally designated rare plant area. And when we pointed that out, it was kind of an embarrassment to them. So they stopped this and let us design a plan that protected the rare plants at Grasslands Regional Park. Well, here's that in that California Rangelands book that I showed you earlier. Here's the map in that book of California Prairie. All the areas in red are what was mapped in that book as California Prairie. And here's a current map of where California Prairie survives. So there's still some around. But you notice right in the middle of the Central Valley, it's brown, and those are the areas where prairie is gone for the most part. And if you look right up, wrong one, go back. That little bit of prairie there, but the most significant piece of prairie anywhere on that line between the Bay Area and the Sacramento area. Well, that little piece of prairie has made the national news. A threat to it was actually not just something that the local folks were aware of. It actually made the New York Times, and it had page after page of comments from all over the world, everybody that reads the New York Times, of how terrible this idea was. Because what happened was all this red was bought up secretly by a group of Silicon Valley billionaires. They didn't tell what it was for. They just called themselves, oh, we're Flannery. We'll give you money for your land. And the land was not terribly rich because it was one of the parts of California, because it's on the Montezuma Hills. It wasn't easy to irrigate. So it was not the most expensive farmland in California. But there were people that wanted to keep farming and didn't want to sell Flannery. Well, they got sued by, and if you know Silicon Valley billionaires, they got unlimited amount of money to sue people. And this is the plan to put a city, complete city, much more isolated even than the one that was planned for Cordova Hills, right in the middle of that land that they bought. If you notice, if you think of the San Francisco area as the mouth and the nose, and the Central Valley where we live has two lobes of a lung, you can think of this as right in the trachea, where all our delta breezes come in that cool us off, so that we're the only place in the United States where it actually gets hotter as you go north away from the delta breeze coming in at Sacramento and Stockton. It gets hotter as you go up to Shasta without a significant Shasta County, without a significant gain in vegetation. Gain in elevation. Another thing that's down there in that footprint of the Flannery, now called California Forever, are these gold fields at Jepson Prairie, because Jepson Prairie is right in the middle of this proposed new town, new city, really. Beautiful close up. Again, a lot like what John Muir described. Bee pastures, wildflowers, as far as you can see, as long as the area is protected by the Jepson Prairie Reserve. And it's got California tiger salamanders, which are getting scarcer and scarcer. It's an area where even when it's not dominated by native species, just the non-native grasses provide homes for many of California's prairie birds that are the most rapidly disappearing group of birds ecologically in all of California, because so much prairie habitat is being written off as free fire zone for development. Meadowlarks with their beautiful songs, mountain plovers, which are quite scarce. Get horned larks, which are hard to find, but if you get in the right kind of prairie, you can see millions of them. There's less and less of that prairie left. Another one that has pretty much the last decades disappeared from Yolo County. It used to be rare but findable here, and now it's almost completely gone, burrowing owls. And then another one that people don't really see very often are grasshopper sparrows. They're only found in this prairie grassland habitat. They need it. If they don't have it, they disappear completely. Well, the people didn't like to be pushed around in Solano County. Some of you that were at the Moloch hearing and saw hundreds of people show up for that to speak to the federal officials on how much we need to protect Moloch, Walker Ridge, and add it to the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. Well, Solano County had as big a group, mostly entirely of locals from all walks of life, here at a meeting to protect their county from these billionaires that want to buy them out and push them out. And it was such an important meeting that the last two speeches were given not just by one congressman, but by two congressmen that showed up and gave the closing speeches that are fully on the side of the locals who want to protect their landscape in eastern Solano County, which is most of eastern Solano County. Anybody want to help protect that?
Yes.
Great. Well, we're actually, first time, the Yolo Colusa chapter, the Jepson chapter, which is Solano County, the Sacramento chapter are all in alliance to help people in Solano County protect themselves from this buyout that would basically threaten our livability here in our Delta breeze. Not to mention lots and lots of important, beautiful, rare species. Well, here's an area that's one of those mosaics that I talked about with prairie and oak woodland and chaparral all in the same place. This is the Tesla area that is in eastern Alameda County and extending into the Central Valley. And this was an area that through great work by the East Bay CNPS chapter, they got that wonderful landscape, and it's many, many rare species protected as a rare plant reserve. Prairies Plain, an area that is the biggest area we still have that's like the bee pastures on a good year that John Muir saw when he crossed the Central Valley. Prairies Plain. I had a hand in getting this. Nature Conservancy asked me if I knew of a place that would be a good one for them to buy, Steve McCormick. And I said, well, I know this place that has more wildflowers than any other place that I have ever seen. And they bought it, then they turned it over and made it a national monument, gave it to the federal government, and it's now the one national monument that's dedicated to the kind of landscapes that John Muir saw when he walked across the Central Valley. Prairies Plain National Monument, flowers as far as you can see. Flowers that were so beautiful that they made the cover of the Jepson Manual that lists all of our wild plants here in California. Flowers as far as you can see, and hardly weeds that replaced bunch grasses. These were the original prairie plants of California as described not only by John Muir, but the first people that wrote about it in Spanish. Here's Montelopia lanceolata, Celia ciliata. Here's an interesting one, Calanthus inflatus. One's a plant with inflated stems. Very, very interesting, unusual plant. And you can find that there in a good year in Carrizo Plain. Here's a big fiddleneck, Amsinkia tessellata, that can cover the landscape there at Carrizo Plains as well. Or the Monolopia lanceolata. And here's a hillside covered with primarily Menselia pectinata. This is right outside of the edge of Carrizo Plain. Well, I found this picture in a book that about the 50 best places to see wildflowers by an Englishman that went all over the world looking for wildflowers. And he put this picture, because it was so spectacular, as the first picture you see when you open the cover of his book. And I was able to get permission from that to use it for the cover of the Primati edition, the former name of the CNPS journal that I helped edit back in 2011. So you notice the same picture with a little different color as in that book. And here's the book, Wildflower Wonders, 50 best wildflower sites in the world. And not only is Carrizo Plain in there, but several other places in California. But primarily, I think, because of our Mediterranean climate, we're one of the most spectacular places anywhere on the planet to see wildflowers. And I hope we protect them and appreciate them. Tejon Ranch was a place that our great conservation chairman for state CNPS, Nicholas Jensen, helped largely protect. It's very significant because it has more ecosystems coming together in one place than I think anywhere else in California. The blue at the bottom is Southern California coast. In the upper left is the Central Valley ecosystem. On the right is the Mojave Desert. And in the center with the green is the Sierra Nevada ecosystem coming right down in the mountains. So it's got a little bit of everything. And it was far too important to just be covered with urbanization. And thanks to Nick Jensen, it is entirely covered by urbanization. A lot of it was protected. Feels like this. California prairie, once again, bee pastures as far as you can see. The prairie is threatened. It can be threatened by, basically on slopes, by expanding vineyards and other crops, and certainly by urbanization. But it shouldn't just be a free fire zone for land use as a place that doesn't matter. It's a landscape like no other on Earth, with plants like no other plants on Earth. Plants with colors like these. This is also in Carrizo Plains. Nothing like this on Earth, and that's what Bob Gibbons saw when he traveled the world. Slopes like this, very compatible with grazing, and colors like you won't see anywhere else on our planet. And by the way, the Central Valley, the home of a lot of this prairie, was an area that is the largest enclosed valley and the most easily seen probably in the entire world from space. It's a really unusual thing that has that unusual system with delta breeze, where the cool air from the coast comes through past this crazy new plan for a city and reaches us here in the Central Valley and keeps our life livable. But you know what? Here's one of those areas of bee pasture. I first saw this picture when a professor came up and showed it to us, and he says, here's an example of how weeds have taken over California, because you don't see any purple needlegrass here. All you see are all these flowers that are weeds that shouldn't be here, that replaced the purple needlegrass. Well, I'd like to see more of this prairie preserved, and we got a few places where it still exists. So our youngsters like Pablo here can go on and still have their kids, when they grow up, seeing what we're able to see now. So California, and this is a different number than I gave earlier, This is a number provided by the Nature Conservancy. It has 4,000, according to the Nature Conservancy, 839 native plants, and more than 39 million people. Both are the most of any state. So conservation here is a real challenge. It could really use your help, the help of all of you. If you'd like to help, please contact me, Dr. Glenn Holstein, California Native Plant Society, Yolo Colusa chapter, and my email is holstein@cal.net. And thanks for coming. It was great talking to you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn.
We have time for good questions. Okay, anybody like to ask a question? See if you can stump me. Maybe you can. I'll learn something. Yeah.
I have a question, Glenn. Yeah, Vicky Hoover.
Okay, Vicky
What,
Hoover.
what
Yes.
can people do to help CNPS chapters protect the area from that new California Forever new community project?
Well, we have, I think the best thing to do right now is to contact Nick Jensen at State CNPS. He's the state conservation coordinator, and he's organizing the opposition. He was down at that big meeting I saw where the Congress people spoke. He was right there with CNPS material, and you can certainly help our chapter here, which I know you're a member of, but also work with Nick on this campaign because he's coordinating the campaign for all of California. Yeah, doing a great job at it. Nick's just an amazing conservationist. He's done more than anybody else I know to preserve the native plants of California. Real hero.
Thank you.
Yes. Good question. Well, we've had quite a bit of rain now, which is a good sign for a good bloom. We had quite a bit of rain last year, and we had quite a nice super bloom. One of the things about the super bloom last year, it was very late arriving. And that's because along with the heavy rains that we got that year, it stayed cold for a long time. So plants need more than just water, they need warm temperatures. So when the water was there and when the temperature started going up, right late actually for a super bloom, it was one of the most spectacular we've ever seen. And so we may have something similar to that this year. And we're doing our California Native Plant Society field trips in partnership with Tuolumne. And Tuolumne is organizing the trips. I'll be leading them, and we'll be taking groups up at different dates. You can contact Tuolumne to get on the list for one of these trips. They fill up pretty fast. I'm not sure which of the trips will have the best flowers. Can't tell yet, but hopefully the one you sign up for will be the top of the line. We hope. I'll get to see them all though. Anybody else?
Not a question, but just a comment. We have still something left over there.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, John. I know that'll be good for those of you that came straight here without stopping for dinner. Thank you for. Did you provide them? Well, thank you for getting her to do it. Thank you. Thanks to both of you for bringing it. And I want to also remind you that to get the latest on contact information for our events, including the field trips we have coming up in partnership with Tuolumne, we have Eileen back there at the table, and she can get your names and your contact information. And if you're wondering whether you're on lists, you can check for you and see. And we'll also, if you want to help with conservation, that would be great too, because we need all the help we can get. It's really critical, and want to be at the forefront of. Thank you. Oh, Mara, hi. Feeling good? Well, they're all a little different. I changed them all. Yeah, and I don't want to just repeat myself. Give the general ideas, but take a little different emphasis. So how's everything going out your way? And I think I saw both of you at the last garden ramble too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
were
to
there.
that one.
And we'll be at the next.
We're gonna, at least for the
There'll be
year, we're
another-
gonna see it every season. she
Another one
plants it.
coming up.
One last subject. I just appreciate it. So
Oh, thank you, thank you. It means an awful lot.
This is why I
coming from
always
you.
back you. Service.
Well, tell you what, you can come to the meeting tomorrow.
The board meetings over, have to be by Zoom.
It is by Zoom, yeah.
You know what? I think seriously, we were on the list and now we're not.
Ah,
And I
Well-
thought that was odd because I used to be getting emails and then
yeah,
all of a sudden, not on
we
there.
have some strange things going on,
Yeah.
and we're gonna try to fix them, but not
Sounds like
tonight.
you can help straighten.
Yeah, she can help you.
Okay,
Absolutely, she's
I
great.
need to take your time. Thank you so
Thanks
much,
so much.
brother.
So you were showing us some of your fancy photographs of the prairie. I'll show you some of mine that I took off of Highway 31, I think, just to the
Uh-huh.
west of I-5. Coming north, last spring.
Yes. It's still here?
It's still there, yeah.
Yep. We
It's
gotta
still
appreciate it.
beautiful,
We just gotta appreciate it.
yeah.
And thanks for
So,
helping spread the word.
yeah,
Yeah, you have
still
questions?
nice. All right, thanks, man.
Oh, okay.
It's at 7, so I came at 7. That's part of it.
Okay, then what?
Oh, I thought the talk was at 7.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But
But you got your part of it, huh? Yeah. Yeah, great. And you're the one with the cookies. Different Ari? Yep. You said.
Oh, the cookie. Yeah. My email.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, it's been great talking to you online, and it's good to actually have you face to face with me for a change, and hopefully you can join us at the meeting tomorrow night.
And you mentioned board. You mentioned the board that you saw.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I did, and kind of there's kind of a lot of emails back and forth about some of the issues, and I think it'll be pretty clear how you can speak up for conservation in case there's a vote. Great.
Yes. I got confused, like what? Like what was going on? It seemed like there was some dispute.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. And if I don't know if you've seen all the emails, but yes, definitely. And the dispute is whether you preserve plants, native plants, or you wipe. And unfortunately, you'd rather wipe her out or it's trying to take
I
over.
guess what I'm confused with the Native Plant Society. Because it's the Native Plant Society.
Well,
I would think there was one.
what happened was when I was just starting a new chapter, I was grateful for any help I could get. And this guy said, well, oh, I want to help you get started. I thought, well, maybe he's just doing it because he's a friend of mine. He had no interest in native plants. Well, he wants to, like the camel, legendary camel that got his nose under the tent. Now he wants to take over the tent and turn the chapter into anti-conservation. So anyway, it'll be kind of clear, but questions? Well, I'm glad even you liked it. Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you. Very
lot of
much.
nice pictures there. Really, really
Yeah.
nice. Well, I've seen some of those pictures, but not all of them. It was just spectacular. Hey, too bad we can't get a postage stamp of those, huh?
Yeah, we know when they put out a postage stamp of California flowers years ago, they put on a native ice plant. Put out the picture on the postage stamp was a non-native ice plant. Non-native ice plant, ice plant. From different continents. So we got a sticker for a native plant. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind ice plants in gardens, but they're not, definitely not native plants.
County, and they used to go, we used to put on ice plants in the county. They're around Newport Bay.
Yeah, and they've escaped really. Yeah, they're not just planted, they're real
Yeah.
escapees there. And I grew up in Southern California, went, I spent a lot of time in Orange County, and but boy, that range you have there is just
The what?
a mountain range going up to
Oh, the
Saddle Mountain.
Santa Ana Mountains, yeah,
Saddle Mountains, yeah.
yeah. One, forget that area. One day I was hiking. It's the closest I've ever come to a rattlesnake. I was hiking there and I jumped up onto this concrete vault. Right on top of this rattlesnake, 4 feet